My name is Evelyn Carter, and for 67 years, I believed the world operated on a system of simple cause and effect. You set your alarm, you woke up, you made your tea, and you went to work. You paid your bills, you tended your garden, you spoke politely to your neighbors. It was a life built on a foundation of quiet predictability, a tapestry woven with threads of routine. I lived in a modest, gray-shingled house at the end of a cul-de-sac in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Ontario, a place where the most exciting event of the week was the arrival of the recycling trucks. My husband, Arthur, had been gone for 5 years, a loss that hollowed me out and left me with an existence that was more about enduring than living. My work as a proofreader for a small local publisher was my anchor, my reason to get out of bed and put on a brave face. It was solitary, precise work, suited to a woman who had become a ghost in her own life. The knock came at 5:07 in the morning. A sharp, insistent rapping that cut through the pre-dawn silence and the gentle hum of my electric blanket. My heart, a tired old bird, fluttered against my ribs. No one knocks at that hour. No one with good news. For a dizzying moment, I was convinced it was a heart attack, not for me, but for someone else, a universal cardiac event manifesting at my door. I fumbled for my glasses, my robe, my courage. The hallway floor was cold beneath my feet. Through the frosted glass of the front door, I could see the distorted shape of a man. I pulled the door open, the chain lock still engaged, and peered out into the chill, damp air. It was my neighbor, Mr. Gable. Leo. He was a man in his late 70s, a retired engineer who lived 2 houses down with his terrier, Baxter. We were what you might call wave and smile neighbors. We exchanged pleasantries about the weather. He'd once helped me jumpstart my old sedan, and I'd occasionally feed Baxter when Leo visited his daughter in Ottawa. But we'd never had a conversation of substance. He'd never stepped foot in my house, and I'd never been in his. Now here he was, his face pale and etched with a profound, unsettling urgency in the sickly yellow glow of the porch light. He was still in his pajamas under a thrown-on windbreaker. "Evelyn," he said, his voice a low, raspy whisper. "Don't go to work today. Just trust me." The sentence hung in the air between us, nonsensical and alarming. I blinked, my sleep-addled brain struggling to process the words. What? Leo, what are you talking about? It's 5 in the morning. "I know what time it is," he said, his eyes, usually twinkling with a joke about the city council, were now dark pools of dread. "Please, call in sick. Say you have a migraine. Say your pipes burst. But do not go into the office. Not today. But I have deadlines. The Henderson manuscript." I protested, the habits of a lifetime of responsibility kicking in automatically. "The manuscript can wait," he insisted, his hand gripping the doorframe. His knuckles were white. "Evelyn, for once in your life, don't be the most reliable person on the street. Just this once. Stay home. Lock your door. Don't answer the phone unless it's me. Just trust an old man who has never once asked you for anything." He looked so desperate, so utterly sincere, that my arguments died in my throat. It was the "trust me" that did it. It was a phrase Arthur had used, always with a smile, when he was planning a surprise for me. A weekend trip to Niagara, a new rose bush for the garden. This was different. This was a "trust me" freighted with fear. I nodded slowly, a stiff, unconvincing movement. "All right, Leo. All right. I won't go." The relief that washed over his face was so immense it was almost painful to witness. It was the look of a man who had just put down a burden he'd been carrying for 1,000 miles. "Thank you," he breathed. "Thank you, Evelyn. I'll explain later. Just stay inside." And with that, he turned and hurried back down my garden path, disappearing into the gloom, a spectral figure in plaid pajama bottoms and a navy windbreaker. I closed the door, my heart hammering. I slid the deadbolt back into place and leaned against the cool wood, trying to make sense of it. What possible reason could Leo Gable have for demanding I skip work? Was he unwell? Delusional? Had he seen something? A premonition? The whole encounter had the quality of a dream, a strange, fevered interruption to my meticulously ordered reality. I walked to the kitchen, my movements automatic, and filled the kettle. Tea would ground me. But as I waited for the water to boil, I stared out the kitchen window at the slowly lightening sky. The street was silent. Empty. It looked exactly as it did every other morning. And yet, everything was different. The hours that followed were an exercise in surreal tension. I called my supervisor, Brenda, and feigned a stomach bug, my voice trembling with a genuineness that came from a place of real, albeit misplaced, anxiety. I spent the morning jumping at every creak of the house, every distant sound of a car engine. I tried to proofread a chapter on European bird migration, but the words swam before my eyes. My concentration was shattered. I was a prisoner in my own home, held captive by a cryptic warning from a man I barely knew. At noon, the silence was broken by the distinct, growing wail of sirens. Not just one, but multiple, a converging chorus of emergency. They weren't on my street, but they were close. Too close. My blood ran cold. I rushed to the living room window, peering through the lace curtains I'd hung with Arthur 40 years ago. I couldn't see the source, but the sound was unmistakable, a relentless, screaming confirmation that something was terribly wrong. My phone, the old landline that Arthur had insisted we keep, rang shrilly, making me jump. The caller ID showed Leo's number. Evelyn. His voice was heavy, thick with an emotion I couldn't immediately place. Turn on the news. Channel 7. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for the remote. The screen flickered to life, showing the familiar face of the local noon anchor, but her professionally composed expression was fractured with genuine distress. Breaking news of a massive gas explosion in the downtown core, she was saying, her voice tight. The incident occurred just before 11:30 a.m. at the old Harrison building on Wellington Street. We have live images now from our helicopter crew. The screen cut to an aerial shot. My breath caught in my throat. I knew that building. It was a 6-story brick structure, a block over from my office. Or rather, it had been a 6-story structure. Now it was a grotesque skeleton of shattered brick and twisted steel, a gaping, smoking mound in the heart of the city. A huge cloud of dust and debris billowed into the sky. Fire trucks, their lights flashing a frantic red, surrounded the rubble, their hoses like tiny threads against the enormity of the destruction. Oh my God, I whispered, my hand flying to my mouth. The initial blast was catastrophic, the anchor continued, and has caused significant damage to surrounding buildings, including the collapse of the western facade of the Pemberton Press building on the adjacent corner. The Pemberton Press building. That was my building. My office was on the 4th floor, the western side. The camera zoomed in, and I could see it clearly, a huge, gaping hole where the windows of my floor should have been. My desk, my chair, the framed photo of Arthur I kept by my monitor, all of it would have been right there, in the path of the collapsing wall from the Harrison building. Early reports indicate the explosion was caused by a catastrophic failure of a century-old gas main, the anchor said. We are receiving confirmed reports of multiple casualties and fatalities. Emergency services are on the scene, but the situation remains chaotic. I sank onto the sofa, my legs unable to hold me. The room tilted. The air grew thick and hard to breathe. The Henderson manuscript, the deadlines, the quiet hum of the office, it was all gone. Pulverized. If I had been at my desk, where I was supposed to be at 11:30 a.m., I would have been gone too. Vaporized. Or crushed. A name on a list for the evening news. A statistic. Leo's voice was a soft murmur in my ear. Evelyn? Are you still there? I'm here, I managed to choke out, tears now streaming freely down my face. They were tears of terror, of shock, but also of a staggering, incomprehensible gratitude. Leo, my office. I would have been. I know, he said softly. I know. How? The question burst from me, a single, desperate syllable. How did you know? There was a long pause on the other end of the line, a silence filled only with the sound of his measured breathing. It's a long story, Evelyn. A story I suppose I owe you. Can I come over? He arrived 10 minutes later, carrying a simple ceramic teapot, the kind that stays warm forever. He'd changed into a sweater and corduroy trousers, but the haunted look was still in his eyes, now mingled with a deep, weary sadness. I let him in, wordlessly, and led him to the kitchen. We sat at the small, formica-topped table where Arthur and I had shared thousands of meals. The familiar setting made the strangeness of the situation even more pronounced. He poured the tea, his hands, spotted with age, remarkably steady. The steam rose between us, a fragrant, comforting veil. I was an engineer, he began, not looking at me, but at his cup. Structural, but I worked on a lot of municipal projects early in my career. I knew the Harrison building. I'd consulted on a retrofit for them back in the 80s. The whole thing was a death trap. The foundation was compromised, the wiring was ancient, and the gas lines, they were a spiderweb of corroded iron, a disaster waiting to happen. He took a slow sip of tea. I'd been badgering the city for years, writing letters, making calls. I was a retired nuisance. They'd send me polite dismissals, telling me it was on the docket for replacement. But the budget was always allocated elsewhere. Last week, I saw a crew digging near the main service entrance. It wasn't a city crew. They were subcontractors, rushing a job, cutting corners. I saw them strike the main line with a backhoe. Just a glancing blow, but it was enough to fracture the pipe. They patched it with a cheap sleeve and poured the concrete back over it. They never reported it. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, forming a picture of horrifying negligence. You saw this. I was there, having lunch in the park across the street. I saw the whole thing. I confronted the foreman. He told me to mind my own business, that it was a surface scratch. But I knew. I've seen enough metal fatigue in my life to know a critical fracture when I see one. I reported it. I called the gas company, the city inspector, everyone I could think of. I was told an investigation would be opened. But nothing happened. Days went by. This morning, I woke up at 4. I couldn't sleep. I just had this feeling. A pressure in the air. I knew it was going to go. I knew the pressure in that line would find the weakness, and that would be it. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were filled with a profound and helpless guilt. I was going to call the news, to stage some kind of protest, but I knew it was too late for that. The only thing I could think to do was to make sure you weren't there. You're always so punctual, Evelyn. You leave at 7:45 on the dot every day. I see you from my window. I knew if anyone was going to be in that building, in that exact part of the building, it would be you. I couldn't save the whole building. I couldn't stop the explosion. But I could. I could try to save you. The simplicity of his logic, the sheer weight of his helplessness, crashed over me. This man, my quiet, unassuming neighbor, had been carrying the knowledge of this impending catastrophe all by himself. He had tried to shout a warning into a void of bureaucracy and indifference, and when no one listened, he had focused his efforts on the one person he felt he could actually reach. Me. You saved my life, Leo, I said, my voice trembling. You knocked on my door, and you saved my life. A single tear traced a path through the wrinkles on his cheek. I wish I could have saved them all, he whispered. The people in the Harrison building, the people in your office. I knew their names, Evelyn. I'd bought coffee from the girl in the lobby cafe. I'd chatted with the security guard. I knew them, and I couldn't save them. We sat in silence for a long time, the weight of the day settling around us. The television was off now, but the images of the destruction were burned onto the back of my eyelids. I thought of Brenda, who always brought in homemade cookies on Fridays. I thought of Mark, the young intern with the bright smile, who talked endlessly about his wedding plans. I didn't know their fates yet, but the odds were not good. I had been spared by a random, miraculous intervention. A thread of grace in a tapestry of horror. In the days and weeks that followed, our quiet suburban street became the center of a different kind of life. The investigation into the explosion was front-page news. Leo's warnings were vindicated, his name mentioned in articles as a Cassandra whose prophecies were ignored. He gave statements, provided documents, and relived the trauma over and over. He was a hero to some, a nag to others. He took no pleasure in it. The guilt of the survivors, a peculiar and painful emotion, began to creep into my own heart. Why was I here, drinking tea in my sunny kitchen, when others were not? Leo and I, bound by this terrible secret, this shared trauma, became unlikely companions. Our wave and smile relationship deepened into a true friendship. He would come over in the evenings, and we would sit on the porch, often not speaking at all. We were two old ships, anchored in the same bay, having weathered the same storm. We talked about Arthur. He talked about his late wife, Clara. We shared memories of a world that seemed to have vanished, not in an explosion, but slowly, incrementally, through the passage of time. I never went back to work. The Pemberton Press building was condemned. The company, what was left of it, offered early retirement packages. I took mine. The rhythm of my life was irrevocably broken. The alarm clock was retired. The routine softened, became more fluid. One afternoon in late autumn, with the leaves turning to fire outside my window, I was looking at the photo of Arthur on the mantelpiece. I used to talk to it, to tell him about my day, about the minor irritations and small triumphs. But that day, I realized I hadn't done that in weeks. The hollow space his death had carved inside me was still there, but it was no longer an open wound. It was a place where something new had begun to grow. A fragile, tentative sense of peace. A connection to the present. Leo had given me more than my life that morning. He had given me back a future. He had shaken me out of my grief-stricken slumber and forced me to re-engage with the world, a world that was brutal and random and beautiful and kind, all at once. He had shown me that even at the end of the road, new paths can appear, forged in the crucible of shared catastrophe. The knock at 5 a.m. was not an end. It was the most terrifying beginning I had ever known. It was the sound of my old life ending and a new, uncertain, but deeply precious one beginning. And as I looked out at the golden autumn light, I understood that the greatest tragedies and the greatest mercies are often woven from the very same thread. And I was, against all odds, still here to feel the fragile, miraculous weight of both. The memory of that 5 a.m. knock had become a ghost limb, a sensation I could still feel tingling in the depths of my soul, long after the physical sound had faded. For months, the world had been painted in the stark, high-contrast colors of trauma. The screech of a tea kettle could send my heart into a frantic tap dance against my ribs. The smell of concrete dust on a windy day would transport me instantly back to that noon newscast, to the image of my office yawned open to the sky. But slowly, as autumn deepened and bled into a harsh Ontario winter, the sharp edges began to soften. The ghost began to lose its power. My friendship with Leo was the anchor in that slow, turbulent recovery. It was a quiet, undemanding thing, built not on grand declarations, but on the simple, solid foundation of shared survival. We were two survivors on a life raft, watching the wreckage of the past drift away. Evenings were no longer spent in the echoing silence of my living room, but at my kitchen table, or on his screened-in porch, often with a game of Scrabble between us. We didn't need to talk about the explosion. Its shadow was a third presence in the room, acknowledged and respected, but not given a voice. It was during one of these quiet evenings, with a gentle snow beginning to blanket the cul-de-sac, that Leo first mentioned the box. We were sipping Earl Grey, the steam fogging the cold window panes. "Clara," he began, his voice taking on that soft, faraway tone it always did when he spoke of his wife. She was a collector of things. Not valuable things. Sentimental things. Ticket stubs, pressed flowers, birthday cards from our granddaughter when she could barely write her name. He smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile that warmed the room. She had this old cedar chest at the foot of our bed. She called it her memory box. I haven't had the heart to open it since she passed. I nodded, understanding completely. Arthur's old tweed coat still hung in the hall closet. I couldn't bear to move it. Lately, though, Leo continued, tracing the grain of the wooden table with his finger, I've been thinking I should. Our daughter, Sarah, she's been asking for some of her mother's recipes. I have a feeling they're in there. But every time I go into that room, my courage fails me. It feels like trespassing. I looked at this man, who had faced down corrupt foremen and indifferent city officials, who had carried the weight of a coming disaster with stoic resolve, now trembling before a wooden box filled with love. My heart ached for him. "Would you like some company?" I asked softly. "When you do it." Sometimes, it's easier not to be alone with those kinds of ghosts. The relief on his face was a mirror of the expression he'd worn on my doorstep months before. Would you, Evelyn? I think I would like that very much. We agreed on the following Saturday afternoon, a time when the winter sun would be at its strongest, casting long, weak rays into the dim corners of his house. When I arrived, the smell of lemon polish and old books greeted me, a distinctly masculine scent that was so different from my own home. Baxter wagged his tail furiously, his little body wriggling with joy at the visitor. Leo led me down the hall to the bedroom. It was neat, Spartan almost, except for the large, ornately carved cedar chest at the foot of the neatly made bed. It seemed to dominate the room, a silent keeper of secrets. Leo stood before it, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked like a boy facing a daunting test. "It's okay, Leo," I said, my voice gentle. "We can just sit here for a bit. There's no rush." He nodded, but after a moment, he drew a deep, shuddering breath and knelt before the chest. The click of the brass latch was loud in the quiet room. He lifted the heavy lid, and a scent wafted out, a beautiful, heartbreaking melange of cedar, lavender, and faded perfume. Clara's scent. The top layer was a neatly folded, hand-knitted afghan in a riot of colors. Leo lifted it out with a reverence that was almost holy. Beneath it was chaos. A beautiful, tender chaos. There were indeed bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon, photo albums with cracked leather covers, a small porcelain doll with one chipped eye, a stack of child's drawings, and yes, a small, floral-patterned recipe box. Leo picked up the recipe box, his hands trembling. He opened it, and a small, yellowed slip of paper fluttered to the floor. I bent to pick it up. It wasn't a recipe. It was a sonogram image, grainy and ancient. Scrawled on the back in a delicate, looping hand were the words, "Our little bean. Due June 1969. Leo saw what I was holding. His face, which had been full of tender memory, went ashen. He took the slip of paper from me, his fingers cold. "I'd forgotten about this," he whispered, his voice cracking. We lost the baby. In the 5th month. A little girl. We named her Rose." He sank back onto the floor, leaning against the side of the bed, the sonogram clutched in his hand. The brave engineer was gone, replaced by a grieving father of 50 years. I sat beside him on the rug, our backs against the bed frame, saying nothing. The silence was a blanket, not a void. "Clara never really got over it," he said after a long while, his gaze fixed on some distant point in the past. "It changed her." A light went out that never fully came back on. She was still my Clara, still wonderful, still the love of my life, but there was always a sadness in her, a quiet space she reserved for the daughter she never got to hold. She blamed herself. The doctors said it was nothing she did, but she never believed them. He told me then about the years that followed. The desperate hope for another child that never came. The way Clara threw herself into her garden, growing roses with a fierce, protective passion. The way she doted on their son, and later, their granddaughter, with a love that was so vast it sometimes seemed to border on fear. "I tried to fix it," Leo said, and the raw confession in his voice was almost too much to bear. "I'm an engineer. I solve problems. I identify the stress point and I reinforce it. But I couldn't fix this. I couldn't weld her broken heart back together. I felt so helpless. All I could do was be there. To hold her when she cried in the night. To bring her cups of tea. To love her through the silence." We sat there for over an hour, surrounded by the physical artifacts of a long, full, but shadowed marriage. Leo talked and I listened. He spoke of picnics and arguments, of financial worries and great joys, of the mundane, beautiful tapestry of a shared life, woven through with a single, dark thread of loss. It was a different kind of 5 a.m. knock. This wasn't a warning of physical danger, but an unlocking of a deep, emotional vault. He had trusted me with his wife's memory, and in doing so, he had trusted me with the most vulnerable parts of himself. The man who had saved my life was showing me the wounds he himself had carried for a lifetime. Finally, he carefully placed the sonogram back into the recipe box and closed the lid. He looked exhausted, but also lighter, as if a pressure valve had been released. "Thank you, Evelyn," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "for being here. Thank you for telling me, Leo, I replied, placing my hand over his. It was a simple gesture, but it felt monumental. We packed the chest back up, leaving the recipe box out for his daughter. As I walked back to my house later, the cold air feeling clean and sharp in my lungs, I realized something had shifted. The ghost of the explosion was still there, but it was no longer the loudest presence in my life. It had been joined by other, older ghosts. Ghosts of lost babies and grieving mothers, of quiet, steadfast love in the face of unfixable pain. Leo hadn't just saved me from a collapsing building. That day, in his bedroom, surrounded by the scent of cedar and loss, he had given me a new lens through which to view my own life. My grief for Arthur was real and profound, but it was the grief for a life fully lived. We had been granted our time. We had raised a family, grown old together. We had been lucky. That night, for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a ghost in my own story. I felt like a person, scarred and weathered, but vitally, fiercely present. The past was no longer a country I was trapped in, but a landscape I had visited, and from which I had returned. And I hadn't returned alone.